Okay, let's build this form using HTML and CSS only. For that, we're going to use GSFiddle. It's just a website that allows you to write HTML and CSS and see the results immediately in the lower section. So the third thing that we're going to do is create background to our page. This case will be a white background. Now, if you check the design, the whole form is enclosed in this big frame that has a header, a content area, and a footer, right? So we want to create, we're going to create a div that contains these three areas, and we can style each of the areas individually. Let's do that first. So as I say, 3 divs, and inside we're going to have a header, we're going to have a content, and we're going to have a footer. Okay, now let's style this to make it look like our design. The first thing I'm going to do is to style the div, the outer div, to be white background, and the border with the rounded corners. Let's call it payment form. So it's going to be background white, background color white. We're going to have a border, solid, 1 pixel, let's say gray. And we have border radius, let's say 6 pixels. You see immediately, we already have our outer div styled this way. Now this gray doesn't look light enough, so let's make it lighter gray. Choose 60C. This is better. Okay, so now let's style the header section. Let's use a bigger font. And let's add some padding. I guess padding of 6 pixels will be good. Now this section, this side of the header has a border bottom. There you go. And of course has a background color. Now, notice that the font doesn't look the same because this is a sans serif font, meaning it's a font that doesn't have any decorations in it. So let's apply a font there you go. Now in the header we have payment form example. Now the font looks a little bit smaller, let's say 26, and it should be a little bit, it should have a little bit of weight. So let's do this. Maybe just a little bit more. There you go. Okay. Now for the footer is also similar. So same background. The footer also has the same padding. The footer also has a border, in this case border top. There you go, and now we have a footer. Now in this case, you see that the header and the footer have the same height. So, and because the fonts are not the same, they will not be the same height. There are several ways that we can fix this. One way is to use a min height property. So min height is the minimum height that the div will have. In this case, the header, let's call it 40 pixels. I think 36 might be a good value. Okay. And if we apply the same min height property to the footer, then we'll make it both look the same height, right? But now the issue is that the text or the content inside is not aligned vertically. One of the ways that we can do that is using flex. So we can make this container a flex and just items sent or align items to the center. So we're going to apply these two properties as well here. And now we have a footer and a header, same height, also aligned vertically. Now in the case of the footer, as you can see here, all the elements of the footer are aligned to the right. So we need to use the justify content, and that will be flex n. There you go. Now the padding, let's give it 0, a little bit more. Okay, so instead of 36, let's use 40. Okay, that's good. Cool. Now in the footer we have two buttons. So the first button says cancel, and the second button says send. Right there. Now the space between them, I would say, is like probably 6 pixels. So one way that we can separate these two buttons is by using a gap. So we can use the gap property in CSS and just establish what will be the gap between those two components. And now we have separation between them. Another way to do it is using margins or padding on one of them, but we don't need to do that because we can use flex properties to achieve this. So I guess it's one of the ways to do it. And of course the buttons are styled. So let's call this a button. Let's call it BTN, and then this will be the button to cancel, and the second button will be BTN, and this is the button to send. Now the reason why I use the same class on both of them is because these two buttons share lots of properties, like the text, the color, both the rounding corners, the size. So I will put all these common properties on the button class, and then the blue and the gray that are relative to cancel and send, I will add it to the specific button send or button cancel. So a regular button will be color white, and it will be a small padding, let's say 4 pixels, and they don't have borders, right? So right now we have this. We can pre-establish a font size of 12 pixels, and that will be good. Now for the button cancel, we're going to establish a background color of gray. Oh, both of them have a border radius of 6 pixels, perhaps a little bit less, 4, and a little bit more of padding, especially horizontal padding. There you go. Now the button send will have a background color blue, right? Of course, this is not the same shade of blue that we have here, but we are not paying attention to that now. I think we should add some vertical padding to these two buttons. We can do it here, and there we have it. Cancel and send. Now, one particular element of buttons when you're styling buttons is that you want buttons to show that they can be clicked in two ways. One is when you hover the button, you want them to show a different color, and you want to change the cursor. So because the cursor is the same for both, then I will do it here. We can use the cursor pointer class. So this will give me this hand. This is pretty common in buttons, right? And to make it a different color when the cursor is over them, we can use the hover modifier. So button cancel hover, and here we're going to use a darker shade of gray. In this case, dark gray. Well, dark gray is not actually a color, so let's use 555. There you go. For the button send, we can use a background color of -005. I guess it's too dark. 008. There you go. Okay, so we have buttons that show when they are being selected. Okay, so then let's move on to the content. So now we have the frame where the form will be created, right? Now for the form, we have all these elements that we have to create. The best way to go with this layout is to use rows. because as you notice, this might be a row. The second row will have car, CVC, and amount. And the third row, because these two set of components are in columns, the third row will have first name, city, and we accept, so the card types. And the second column will have last name, state, and postal code, and message. The only problem that I'm seeing with this is that if you do it this way, then you will have to modify the tab index. So when the user goes from first name and hits tab, instead of going to city, it should go to last name, right? So you can do columns, or you can just keep doing rows. So the second row will be first name, last name, and then the third row will be city, state, postal code, and then the last row will be we accept and message. So let's do it that way. We will have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows. So inside content, we're going to create 5 rows. Here we are. So we're going to have a row for the alert message. We're going to have a row for car, CVC, and amount. We're going to have a row for first name and last name. And we're going to have a row for city, state, and postal code. And another row for cars and message. Okay, so that will be all the rows that we want to create in our content section. Now, all the elements in the content section should also have some type of padding. So in the content section style, we're going to add some padding to that content section. And here we have it. So you see we have alert message, there will be the first row, car, CVC, amount, second row, first name, last name, third row, city, state, postal code, fourth row, and cards and messages, the last row. Okay, so now let's create the first row. Actually, the first row is just a component, so we don't have to create a row there. We can just create a component. In this case, it's just an alert message that some fields are missing. As you can see, this has a border, it has the same radius, it has some red text. So let's create that for the message. So class alert. So the alert, we're going to style it with a background. Let's say it's going to be pink. The border will be solid, 1 pixel red. Border radius will be 4 pixels. Let's give it some padding. I think it should have more padding, yes. And the text color should be red. Okay, that will be our alert message. Now, notice that the alert and the next row are too close together. So there should be a way for us to space that the same way as the space right here. And since the space is usually very uniform, we're going to use gap. So in the content div style, we're going to say that this will be a flex container we're going to set the flex container direction to be a column, and then we're going to use a gap of 10 pixels to separate all the elements in that container. I think 10 pixels is good. If we can separate it by, let's say, 20 pixels, it will look a little bit more space, right? So we don't have to set margins or padding from one component to the other. We can use just a flex container and gap to separate them. Now let's do the next. The next row is car CVC amount. As you can see, car probably occupies 40%, then CVC and amount take the remaining 30 and 30%. Let's organize it that way. So let's do car. We're going to say this is a flex container. Of course, the flex direction is row. By default, the flex direction is row. We don't have to directly specify, but I like to be explicit when I'm creating CSS styles, so I'm specifying that flex direction will be row. And then the gap between the elements will be 20 pixels. Now, inside the car, we need to create a div for every section of the form. So one div for the car, one div for the CVC, and last a div for the amount. Okay. Now you notice that the space between them is 20 pixels, 20 pixels. Okay, but the size of each one of them let's call this car container to separate it from car that we will have here. So for the car, let's start the car. So we have to set the classes CVC and amount. I'm just giving them every element a class name so we can identify it in the CSS. So car will have a flex basis of 40%. And now that car element takes 40%. For the CVC element, we're going to use a flex basis of 30%. And for the amount element, we're going to take a flex basis of 30%. There you go. Now let's check what is the content of each one of these elements. So the first element is the car number with an input. The second one is the CVC with an input, and then the amount with an input. For the car, we're going to get the label first. The label will be car number, and then we're going to have the input type number. Right? Now, the only thing that we need to specify here is the ID. So in the label, we can say that this label is for the car. There you go. Now, this car should also be a column because we want them to be in a one on top of the other. So we can establish here that this will be display flex, and the flex direction will be column. Now, if there is some space between them, That space, we don't need margins for that. Since this is a flex, that these two elements are inside a flex container, we can use, again, the gap property. So gap, let's say 10 pixels. Okay? So this is how it's looking. Let's do it smaller, 6 pixels. Okay? Now, these same styles, flex direction, is probably the same styles that we're going to apply to pretty much every component here. So the best way to go here is to take these styles that will be common and put it in a single class. Let's call it input container. So now we can take every element and say this is an input container. And also set that this is a car. So car input container, CVC input container, and amount input container. That way, when we create our CVC section, label CVC input type number ID CVC, and you say this is for the CVC input. Notice that the CVC input will already be styled with the same spacing, and it will be vertical. Same for the amount. I will copy paste this because I know already that this is the same. So this is for amount. I will write here amount, and this will be amount. There you go. Okay. Now the amount input, in the amount input we have a small $sign here that we want to also use. So in this case, we can put the $sign in front of the input. But if we do this, notice that since we are using a flex box, then the $sign will also be one element in that. It will be a row in that column, right? Because it's a flex direction column, then everything inside that div will be in a column. So label, then the $sign, and then the input. Now we want to put the input in front of the $sign in front of the input, right? There's several ways that you can do this. The way I usually prefer to go about this is to use, again, flex. So I can wrap these two elements inside of flex. Right? And give it a class. Let's call it a row. Let's call it input with icon. Let's call it like that. So for me, an input with an icon will be a display flex, a flex container, and I will give it a little bit of gap of 10 pixels. Okay, so we have our first line. Of inputs. Now, one thing about the inputs is that they are also styled. So the inputs that you can see here has a border, but the border has a corner radius, and the borders are a little bit lighter. So let's style that a little bit. So let's call that all the inputs in this page will have a border that is solid 1 pixel, and it will be this gray. The other thing is that all the inputs in this page will be border radius of 4 pixels, and they will also have a padding of 4 pixels and 10 by 10. Let's give it a little bit more of padding, and that looks a lot better. Okay, great. Now we have to do the second column. Now the second column is pretty similar to the first one, right? So if you check, we have a card container. So we will have something similar to the card container, except that this will have only 2 columns, but the same properties will be applied. So we can say that this will be an inputs container. Or let's call it row input container. So I'm changing the name of this card container class to be rows input container. So I can use the same class again here, reuse it, because the styles will be the same. Once I have this, I can do first and second and last name. And this will be also first name, but also will be an input container. I'm reusing the class that we already have here. And the second will be the last, an input container. Now, for those two, first I would say, and actually the last class will be the same, flex basic, 50%. So each column will be using 50% of the space. Now, for each one of those, we're going to have an input. Now, since the code for the input is pretty similar to the one that we have before, I will just copy paste those 2 lines, right? So first, we will have this for first. I'm just copy and changing the values. So this will be text, and the ID will be first. And the same for the second. So it will be last, so first name, last name, this also type text, ID will be last. There we go. So card, CVC, amount, first name, last name. Now, for first and last name, I will add a name property, a name attribute, just to avoid these autocomplete issues. Actually, it's not in the label, it's in the input, remember. Great, it's looking good. Okay, and now we have third column. The third column will be city, postal, city state, and postal code. And the way they are organized is city takes 50%, and then state and postal code take 25 and 25%. Okay, but the container should be the same. It should be a class row inputs containers. These row input containers, remember, already has a set of properties that are flex, direction row, and has gap 20. That means that it will be several columns separated by 20 pixels. Okay? In this case, the first column will be the city. The second column will be state. And the last column will be the postal code. Right? Now, every column will have the input container class, because an input container class will be a flex container direction column with a gap of 6 pixels. That means that it will be something like this. It will be the label and then the input, and they will separate it by 6 pixels, right? And I also need another class for them individually. And the reason behind that is because I want to style the width of that class. So city, then we have state. It's also an input container. And then we have the postal code, also an input container. Okay, so we have city. We said that it's going to be 50%. We said that the state will be 25%, and the postal code will be the same percent. So we can do dot postal code 25%. So now the columns are created. Okay, now let's copy the code for the city. So this is for city, and city. There you go. Now we have one for state. And the last one will be for postal code. Now, postal code is usually a number. Here we go. Okay, and last but not least, we need the accept, that's a radio button, and message, just a text area. So same way, we create this class as a row inputs container. And for each one of these, we're going to have a div. So div for the cars and a div for the message. And the one for the cars will be accepting cards, and also will be an input container. Although, oh yeah, we accept, yes, this is correct. And the second one will be a message and also an input container. Now, the sizes will be accepting cards and message will both be flex basis 50%. Okay, so now for the cards, we do have a label that says accepting, or we accept. And this will be for the accepting cards. Now for the radio, okay, so for the, in the case of the radio buttons, notice that this radio button, every element has its own label, right? So this is not, this we accept is not technically a label, it's just a text that we have on the screen. We can use the label tag for it, but it's fine if we use another element, because the labels of the radio tags are actually the elements next to them, right? So for in this case would be, I think this is the MasterCard logo, Visa, I think it's Diners, and American Express logo, right? So we're going to choose the div to show we accept, and then we're going to have a label. Oh, we're going to have the radio button first. Let's call it card type, and this will be the first one, MasterCard. Type radio, right? So we have the input, and then we put the label after that. For, in this case, will be MasterCard. Remember, the for property references the ID of the input. So the label for MasterCard will be, just let's put MasterCard. Now, because we want this to be a single row, I'm going to create a div here. Let me tidy up this. As you can see, now we have a single row with we accept and then MasterCard. And we have to do the same for all of them. So first is MasterCard, the second one is a Visa, and it will look like this. Now I will only add these two. You can add all of them. The other thing is I'm not using images. Okay. but it's fine. If you want to put an image, you can put the image inside the label, so the label is still actionable. That means that when you click the label, then the radio will be selected. I would leave it like this. And then for the second one, let's add the label for the message. And then we have the message. Now the message area is, we're going to use a text area. And there we have it. That's our form. Of course, we need to style this using the same style as the inputs. I think we can also do it like this, text area directly here. So that means that both inputs and text area will have the same styling. And that's our form. Now, how can we see this in a bigger size? Like this. It's not. No, actually, we're missing this add any notes here. So that should be below. Let's style it as well. Notes here. I think it's just a font size smaller, like 8 pixels, and a lighter color like this, a little bit bigger. There you go. Great. So that's our form, as similar as possible to this one. Of course, not pixel perfect, but still we created using HTML and CSS. And in CSS, we reuse some classes, and when we want to style or do a layout, we use flex containers. Okay, so I will share this. Fiddle with you, so you can use it in your. And I will also share the code in the video. That's all. See you next class.